They appeared as if out of nowhere. Men in white cloaks with a red cross on their chests. At first, just 9 knights who swore to guard the road to the Holy Land. Later, an all-powerful order, owning fortresses, gold, and secrets. They were not merely warriors. Where the power of the sword ended, the power of knowledge began. They spoke with kings, held popes by the throat, vanished into the sands of Palestine, and whispered of the Grail. They called themselves warriors of light, marched under the Red Cross in the name of God. Yet behind them lay burned villages, prayers whispered over dying embers, and blood on the altars. They said, "This is the will of heaven." But does holiness demand the smoke of burning libraries and the screams of those who refused to bow to their sword? And then, one day, everything collapsed. Executions, accusations, curses. And only one question still troubles historians and romantics alike. Who were they, truly? Knights of God, or terror wrapped in monastic robes? My dear friends, welcome to the official channel Midnight Lecture, a place where dreams turn into knowledge, and that very voice guides you through the silence of the night. Tonight, we unravel one of the most mysterious threads of history. We will dive into the era of crusades, secret initiations, forbidden knowledge, and ancient legends. We will discover who the Templars were, how they rose, why they were destroyed, and what among it was truth, and what was fear born in the hearts of those who trembled before their power. We will walk behind those who called themselves the Knights of the Temple, and try to understand who they were in reality. True protectors of the holy places, or executors of religious terror that burned and broke in the name of the cross. Make yourself comfortable. Before you lies a story where light and darkness intertwine so tightly that perhaps even the Templars themselves no longer knew with whom they had made their pact. If you enjoy falling asleep to our videos, listening to that familiar voice with verified information and perfect pronunciation, support our journey. Subscribe to the channel, tap the bell, and leave a few warm words in the comments. Your kindness is like a small flame in the quiet. It helps create new stories and continue telling them for you. Now wrap yourself in a blanket, lay your head on the pillow, and let everything worldly slip away. Close your eyes our story begins. Unlike ordinary knights who fought for honor, glory, or land, the Templars were something more. They were warriors of God, yet owed allegiance to no king. They were monks, yet commanded one of the deadliest forces of the Middle Ages. They were poor by their rule, but their treasure, hidden in castle vaults and temple chambers, still provokes treasure hunters' imaginations today. But why did the Templars become a symbol of mysteries, conspiracies, and vanished relics? After all, there were many military orders at the time. The Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights of St. Lazarus. Yet it was they, the Templars, who survived in memory as guardians of the Grail, keepers of forbidden knowledge, and victims of a great betrayal. To understand where this legend began, we must return to Europe at the dawn of the 10th century, a world where religion decided the fate of nations, and knights rode out to die for Jerusalem. It was the era of the Crusades, a war that gave birth to both saints and villains. And in this war, the Templars became both the main heroes and the main victims. At the end of the 10th century, Europe stood on the edge of great upheaval. Fragmented kingdoms lived by the sword. Chivalry was slowly turning into a military elite, and the Catholic Church sought ways to strengthen its authority. The power of the Pope was growing, but the religious world was filled with anxiety. Muslims held the Holy Land, and the Christian world considered this unacceptable. Everything changed in 1095, when at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II delivered a speech that launched one of the greatest movements of the Middle Ages. He declared that Muslims not only controlled Jerusalem, but oppressed Christians, plundered holy sites, and destroyed temples. His words ignited a wave of religious fanaticism across Europe. But it wasn't only anger that drove people. Urban II promised the Crusaders something far greater. Everyone who set out for the Holy Land would have their sins forgiven. This meant that anyone, knight, peasant, or even criminal, could cleanse their soul and guarantee themselves a place in heaven. The Pope's call came at a moment when Europe was already prepared for such a campaign. Feudal lords sought new lands, knights sought new wars, and peasants sought salvation from poverty. For many, the crusade became a chance to change their destiny. And so, in 1096, the first columns of people who had taken up the cross began moving eastward. It was a chaotic flood. Thousands of people, most of whom had neither weapons nor experience. They were led by a fanatic preacher, Peter the Hermit, who convinced them that God himself would lead them to victory. But reality was merciless. This poorly armed and poorly prepared crowd of crusaders, known as the People's Crusade, didn't even make it to the Holy Land. They moved through the Balkans, looting and destroying everything in their path. And when they reached the borders of Byzantium, they became a problem, even for the Christian emperor. But the real catastrophe was still ahead. In Asia Minor, they were met by the Seljuk army, which utterly annihilated the Crusader mob in a series of battles. Only small, scattered groups of survivors reached Constantinople, where the emperor quickly sent them away to rid himself of the trouble. But soon after them came the real armies. In 1097, the armies of Western European knights gathered, feudal forces made up of well-trained warriors. These were men accustomed to war, who understood that the journey to the Holy Land was not a pilgrimage, but a military campaign. They did not leave chaos behind them, as the People's Crusade had. They built discipline, prepared for battle, and forged alliances. Among them were commanders like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, battle-hardened warriors driven by both military ambition and personal interest. When their armies marched eastward, the Crusaders encountered a world completely unlike their own. Asia Minor was controlled by the Seljuks, a powerful and well-organized force that had already crushed the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert. But the Crusaders were no less dangerous. They stormed cities, marched through hostile lands, endured disease, hunger, and scorching heat. Yet they kept moving. They pushed toward their goal, the Holy Land. It was this campaign, structured as a true military operation, that marked the beginning of the Crusaders' presence in the East. They arrived not simply as pilgrims, but as an army determined not only to liberate Christian holy sites, but to establish themselves on these lands. This was the first step toward creating the Crusader states and toward the rise of the first military orders. Amid chaos, war, and religious fanaticism, ideas were already forming. Ideas that, decades later, would give birth to the most famous knights of the Middle Ages, the Order of the Templars. After years of marching, endless battles, and brutal hardships, the Crusader army finally reached its destination. They had traveled thousands of kilometers, survived the fighting in Asia Minor, endured sickness and starvation. But all of that was merely a prologue to their greatest trial. Jerusalem, the holy city for which they had left their homes, risked their lives, and dreamed of eternal salvation. The city was the final goal of the First Crusade, and for many, capturing it meant fulfilling a vow made before God. But when the knights saw the walls of the holy city, they were met with harsh reality. Ahead lay one of the most difficult sieges of their lives. At that moment, Jerusalem was under the control of the Egyptian Fatimid Caliphate. The city was heavily fortified. Its walls seemed impregnable. The defenders knew the Crusaders would not retreat and were prepared to fight to the last breath. The Crusaders, meanwhile, were in a dire situation. Heat, lack of water, and dwindling supplies turned their camp into a living hell. Men were already dying from thirst and disease, but retreat was impossible. Realizing that without siege engines, the assault was doomed, the Crusaders began gathering wood to build towers and battering rams. This quickly turned into a major problem. There were almost no trees near Jerusalem. They had to dismantle houses, search for timber far away, and drag heavy logs under the blazing sun. Meanwhile, a wave of religious fervor swept through the camp. The warriors fasted, prayed, and then walked barefoot across the desert around the city, imitating, as legend said, the march around Jericho before its walls collapsed. The assault began on July 14th. For 2 days, the Crusaders launched relentless attacks on the walls, but the defenders fought back with astonishing determination. Only at dawn on July 15th did the Crusaders manage to break into the city. It was a moment of triumph and horror. When the Crusaders entered Jerusalem, a massacre began. Warriors who had marched for years toward this moment now showed no mercy. The streets filled with blood. Homes turned into death traps for civilians. Chroniclers describe scenes that chill even modern readers. Swords never cooled. Bodies were piled in heaps. Blood literally flowed down the steps of the Temple Mount. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, knights knelt, ankle-deep in blood, and thanked God for their victory. But what did this victory mean in the long run? The Crusaders believed that the Christian world would now possess Jerusalem forever. Yet the massacre they carried out not only wiped out the Muslim and Jewish population, but forever turned the Crusaders into hated invaders in the eyes of the entire East. In the Islamic world, this event became a symbol of Christian brutality, a wound that would fuel the idea of vengeance for Jerusalem for generations. From a military standpoint, the Crusaders had won. From a geopolitical standpoint, they had committed one of the greatest mistakes in history. Instead of trying to build alliances with local rulers or offer compromise, they laid the foundation for future wars that would last for centuries. Their triumph became the beginning of their own downfall. Now, a new question stood before them: how to hold the Holy Land. The warriors who had entered Jerusalem could not remain there forever. Many dreamed of returning home with whatever spoils they had gathered. But who, then, would defend the city? Who would hold power in such a dangerous and hostile region? And so, a new idea emerged. The idea of creating elite warrior monks who would be not just knights, but guardians of the Holy Land. Among the first of these men were those who would soon be known as the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, and whom the world would come to know as the Templars. But danger surrounded the Crusaders from every side. They now found themselves encircled by Muslim powers they had gravely insulted by slaughtering the population of Jerusalem. The Seljuks in Syria and the Fatimids in Egypt had no intention of leaving this loss unanswered. They were gathering strength, preparing for a counterstrike. Yet the threat came not only from outside, but from within. After the conquest of Jerusalem, thousands of pilgrims began streaming into the Holy Land. They longed to see the Holy Sepulchre, to pray in the places where, according to tradition, Christ had walked. But their journeys led through lands that were far from safe. Caravans often became targets for bandits or Muslim raiders who operated from the mountains and deserts. Local tribes attacked travelers, stole their gold and supplies, and sometimes killed everyone without exception. Leaving Jerusalem without armed escort meant almost certain death. The Crusaders tried to impose order, but lacked the strength. Their army was small. Their garrisons were scattered across vast territories. Every new knight arriving from Europe was more a mercenary than a defender of the kingdom. He fought for himself, for plunder, for profit, not for the Holy Land. In 1119, 10 years after the capture of Jerusalem, a group of knights, led by Hugues de Payens, approached King Baldwin II with an unusual proposal. They declared that they were ready to guard the roads and protect the pilgrims, but not as mercenaries and not as vassals, but as monks who had taken a vow of loyalty to God. This was unheard of. In those days, knighthood and monastic life were completely separate worlds. Monks took vows of poverty and non-violence, while knights lived by war and plunder. But now, a new type of warrior appeared. A monk with a sword. Hay vowed to fight, but not for wealth, only for faith. Baldwin supported their initiative and settled them in the buildings of the former Al-Aqsa Mosque, located on the Temple Mount. According to tradition, this was the site of the destroyed Temple of Solomon. And from this place, the Knights took their name, the Order of the Poor Fellow. Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, or simply the Templars. At first, they truly could be called poor. They had neither wealth nor influential patrons. According to legend, in the early years, their symbol was an image of two knights sharing a single horse, a sign of their humility and poverty. They lived on alms, wore simple white cloaks, and followed a strict discipline. Their mission was dangerous: to patrol the roads, protect pilgrims, and fight bandits and Muslim raiding parties. Yet despite their ascetic life, behind them stood a powerful idea: to be defenders of Christianity, to live by a strict rule, and to fight not for themselves, but for God. Gradually, rumors of these knights reached Europe. The Templars began attracting the attention of noble families who saw in them not just warriors, but a new kind of Christian hero. Over time, it became clear that the Templars had not only survived, but earned a reputation as the finest defenders of the Holy Land. Still, their position remained unstable. Without official church support, their status was uncertain. They were knights, yet not subject to any king. Monks, yet not part of any established monastic order. The solution came in 1129, when a church council was held in the city of Troyes. There, the Templars were officially recognized by the Catholic Church as a monastic military order. Their rule was written by the influential theologian Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the chief ideologists of the crusading movement. He presented the Templars as the ideal knights of God, men who did not seek earthly glory, but waged a holy war in the name of faith. Church recognition meant that the Templars now answered not to secular rulers, but directly to the Pope. This granted them enormous privileges: independence from local laws, exemption from taxes, the right to build their own fortresses, and the ability to collect donations all across Europe. From that moment, the order began to grow rapidly. Noble knights skilled in the art of war joined their ranks. European aristocrats donated land and money, seeing it as a way to cleanse their sins. And the Pope himself supported the Templars as his personal army in the Holy Land. Their lives were governed by strict rules combining monastic asceticism with military discipline. This made them a unique warrior caste, unlike any other knightly order of the time. Every Templar took 3 main vows: chastity, poverty, and obedience. This meant complete renunciation of personal life, property, and ambition. Upon joining the order, a knight surrendered his titles, lands, and inheritance. If he was married, he had to leave his family forever. If he owned castles or estates, he transferred them to the order's possession. From that moment on, his only family became the brothers of the order, and his home, fortresses, and commanderies scattered across Europe and the Holy Land. The Order of the Templars was strictly organized and possessed a clear hierarchy that distinguished it from ordinary feudal armies. Where common knights obeyed their lords, lords who could act independently and pursue their own interests, the Templars were part of a rigid system governed by unified laws. At the head of the order stood the Grand Master. He was elected for life and wielded absolute authority. The Grand Master not only commanded the army, but negotiated with kings, popes, and Byzantine emperors. He could declare wars, sign peace treaties, and issue decrees concerning both military campaigns and the internal structure of the order. The Marshal of the Order was its chief military commander. He oversaw the training of knights, the supply of the army, and the tactics of battle. It was he who developed strategies, distributed forces, and commanded on the field when the Grand Master himself was absent. The Seneschal managed the entire administrative system of the order. He controlled finances, allocation of resources, appointed leaders of individual commanderies, and supervised the collection of taxes and donations. The commanders, in turn, governed the fortresses, castles, and lands of the order in various regions. In the Holy Land, they acted as military governors, responsible for defense and maintaining the constant readiness of their garrisons. In Europe, the commanders oversaw fundraising, recruitment, and negotiations with local nobility. The knights of the order were its elite, heavily armed horsemen who could be called the special forces of the medieval world. They were among the most disciplined and battle-ready warriors of their time. But the order was not made up of knights alone. Sergeants, men of lower social origin, formed a significant part of the Templar forces. They served as heavy infantry, managed castles, and oversaw the daily workings of the estates. Many acted as squires to the knights, but they could also command small units. In addition, the order included chaplains, priests who provided spiritual support, conducted liturgy, and heard the confessions of the brothers. Finally, a special role was played by the Turcopoles, light cavalry recruited from local Eastern Christians. They were not full members of the order, but served in combat units and helped the Templars adapt to the fast, mobile tactics of Muslim cavalry. This entire structure functioned as a single mechanism, making the order an incredibly efficient organization. Life in the order was governed by the strict rule adopted in 1129. It regulated every aspect of a Templar's existence: how he should dress, eat, sleep, train, and even how he should remain silent. The day began at dawn with prayer. Then came breakfast, simple food consisting of bread, vegetables, beans, fish, or meat, though meat was allowed no more than 3 times a week. Templars were forbidden to eat alone. Meals were taken in complete silence, accompanied by the reading of religious texts. After eating, military training began. The Templars practiced daily horseback riding, archery, and swordsmanship. Special attention was given to fighting in formation. Knights learned to attack as a single front, protect one another, and react instantly to commands. But life in the order wasn't limited to war. The Templars also cared for their horses, repaired weapons, studied maps, and copied documents. Many of them spoke multiple languages, since the order maintained active negotiations with Byzantium, Arab states, and European monarchs. The vow of obedience held special importance. Unlike secular knights, who could refuse orders or retreat from the battlefield, Templars had no right to act on their own. They were required to fight to the end, even if the enemy vastly outnumbered them. Leaving the battlefield without an order was considered treason, punishable by expulsion. It was precisely this iron discipline and strict rule of life that made them some of the most fearsome warriors of the Middle Ages. Where ordinary knights could waver or flee, the Templars fought to the last man. Their organization, loyalty to the Brotherhood, and absolute devotion to their mission created an aura of indestructibility around them. Every knightly order had its own emblem, but the Templars' red cross on a white cloak became one of the most recognizable symbols in history. Originally, the brothers wore simple white garments without any marking. This emphasized their humility, their rejection of personal ambition, and their pursuit of spiritual purity. White symbolized innocence and holiness, reminding the world that Templars were not ordinary knights, but monks dedicated to serving God. However, in 1147, Pope Eugene III officially granted the order the right to wear the Red Cross, a symbol of martyrdom, sacrifice, and readiness to die for the faith. This emblem turned the Templars into warriors chosen by God. In battle, it was meant to remind them that their death would not be in vain, for they fought for a cause beyond worldly goals. The shape of the cross varied, sometimes straight, sometimes with flared ends, but it was always scarlet, the color of blood, Shah for Christ. And the oath of the order was to never retreat before the enemy. The Templars believed that death in battle was the greatest victory, for a fallen knight passed instantly into God's kingdom. Unlike ordinary knights, who decorated their cloaks with coats of arms, gold, and luxurious furs, Templar clothing remained strictly ascetic. They were forbidden from wearing personal insignia so that no one would stand out among the brothers. This emphasized their equality within the order. On the battlefield, they were one family, both nobles and commoners alike. But this symbol was not only a sign of devotion and faith. Over time, it became a sign of power. When European monarchs saw the Red Cross, they understood that standing before them were members of a formidable organization that obeyed no king and acted only by the will of the Pope. Originally, the Templars truly matched their name, the Poor Knights of Christ. They possessed no personal estates or wealth. They lived on donations flowing in from Christians across Europe, noble families believing it their duty to support the Holy Land, granted the order lands, castles, money, and agricultural estates. But the more the order's influence grew, the more its holdings expanded. The Templars did not merely collect gold. They knew how to manage it. Unlike secular lords, who wasted fortunes on lavish feasts and tournaments, the order used its resources with strict purpose. Their fortresses were built according to a unified plan. Grain from their fields was distributed in carefully calculated amounts, and gold was never left idle. It was put into circulation. Thus, the order slowly transformed into a financial structure comparable to the First International Bank. Their network of commanderies spread across all of Europe, and each node of this network served as a vault, a transit point, and a financial center. One of the Order's greatest innovations was their system of deposits and checks. European pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land risked being robbed along the way. To avoid this, they could leave their money in one of the Order's branches, for example in Paris or London, and receive a special document with codes. This document could then be presented in another commandery, such as in Acre or Jerusalem, to receive the equivalent amount. In essence, the Templars invented the first system of traveler's checks, making journeys across the Mediterranean much safer. But more importantly, this gave the Order enormous financial power. Receiving funds for safekeeping, they could invest them in fortress construction, weapons, and military equipment. Over time, kings and noble families began borrowing money from the Order. The Templars lent monarchs colossal sums, but demanded guarantees in return: lands, privileges, and sometimes even political concessions. The Templars became a true state within the Crusader world. They possessed not only the best trained troops, but also their own territories, garrisons, fleet, and system of governance. Unlike kingdoms that depended on feudal knights, their power rested on iron discipline and meticulously organized defense. But their principal instrument of power was their fortresses, scattered across the Middle East. These strongholds were impregnable bastions protecting conquered lands, controlling trade routes, and ensuring strategic dominance in the region. The Order built its castles so they could not be taken neither by storm nor by siege. They stood atop cliffs, their walls merged with sheer drops, and their internal layout turned each fortress into a multi-level defensive labyrinth. Among all their strongholds, the most famous was Crac de Chevalier, the greatest Crusader castle, standing in modern-day Syria near the city of Homs. This colossal stronghold rose more than 600 meters above the surrounding landscape, offering a full view of everything for many kilometers around. It stood on a strategically crucial road between Antioch and Tripoli and controlled the entire northern route of the Crusaders. Crac de Chevalier was a true fortress city, designed to house a garrison of up to 2,000 soldiers. Its outer walls, reaching 3 meters in thickness, were built at an angle, forcing enemy projectiles to slide downward and lose their destructive force. Behind the first defensive line were several more layers of fortification, turning the stronghold into an impenetrable citadel. Inside the castle was everything needed for a siege lasting many years: enormous granaries, water cisterns, armories, stables, living quarters, and even a church where the knights prayed before battle. Crac des Chevaliers was considered invincible. Even when Saladin's armies besieged it, they were unable to break through its defenses. The fortress was surrendered only in 1273, after the defenders received a forged letter, supposedly from Christian command, ordering them to abandon the stronghold. It was the only way Crac could be taken. By force, it was never conquered. Another crucial coastal outpost of the order was the fortress of Atlit, located on the Mediterranean shore south of modern-day Haifa. Its main purpose was to protect pilgrims and merchant routes, linking the Holy Land with Europe. Atlit housed one of the largest Templar garrisons, and its powerful walls made the fortress nearly unassailable, both from land and sea. Atlit became one of the very last Christian bastions in the Middle East. Even after the fall of Acre, the garrison continued to hold out. Only when it became clear that no help would come from Europe did the remaining Templars abandon the fortress, board ships, and sail to Cyprus. Today, most of it lies in ruins, yet its massive remains still testify to the former might of the Templars. Another important stronghold was the fortress of Tortosa, located in modern-day Lebanon. Unlike many other castles, it was never taken by assault. Standing on the coast, it played a key role in the Templars' intelligence network. From here, the Crusaders watched the movements of Muslim armies and monitored trade routes connecting the Middle East with Europe. Tortosa was one of the last Christian outposts in the region. Even when Crusader states began to fall one after another, this fortress remained in the hands of the order. As their fortresses and land holdings expanded, the Templars gradually transformed from a knightly order into an independent political force. Their military bases, spread not only across the Holy Land, but throughout Europe, allowed them to remain completely independent from kings and feudal lords. No monarch could demand feudal service from them. They obeyed only the Pope, which meant they could pursue their own policies without asking permission from local rulers. This made them dangerous players on the international stage. The order's administrative system resembled a centralized state. Its territories were divided into provinces, each governed by a commander appointed by the Grand Master. Within these territories, they collected taxes, controlled trade routes, managed agriculture, maintained garrisons, and reinforced fortresses. The order had its own laws, its own courts, and even its own diplomatic missions. They negotiated on equal footing with kings, forged alliances, and at times intervened in conflicts as an independent military power. Let us examine the most famous battles where the order demonstrated its military might. One such battle was the Battle of Montgisard, where just 500 knights and several thousand infantry crushed Saladin's enormous army. By the autumn of 1177, the Holy Land was engulfed by a new wave of war. From the south advanced a massive army under Sultan Saladin, more than 26,000 warriors. This was not a band of raiders or scattered feudal levies, but a fully organized war machine composed of elite Mamluks, heavy and light cavalry, archers, and infantry. Saladin aimed to strike at Ascalon, a major coastal city crucial for supplying the Kingdom of Jerusalem. If it fell, the road to the Holy City would be open, and nothing would stop the Muslim army. Jerusalem had no force capable of halting the invasion. Its fortresses held garrisons, but they were scattered across the land. Many knights were far away, and some royal vassals showed no desire to join the campaign. The king's council urged retreat behind the walls and to try to endure a siege. But King Baldwin IV made a different choice. He would not wait for the enemy's blow, nor hope that Saladin would withdraw on his own. He decided to strike first, though to many it seemed pure madness. Young Baldwin, the son of King Amalric, was only 16, yet his fate had already been sealed. Since childhood, he suffered from leprosy, a disease considered a death sentence in the Middle Ages. His hands and feet gradually lost sensation. His skin was covered with sores, and his face became disfigured. A normal person with such a diagnosis would have been sent to a leper hospice or monastery. But Baldwin was a king. He could not abandon his destiny, and despite the illness, he not only held power, but became a true warrior. He could sit in the saddle, wield a sword, devise tactics, negotiate with rulers, and, most importantly, make decisions that determined the future of his kingdom. This time, he chose to gather everything he had and march to meet Saladin. Under his banner were only 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. Among them was a small but priceless detachment. Around 80 Templars, hardened veterans considered the elite of Christian warfare. No one believed such a small force could challenge Saladin. No one, except Baldwin and his knights. Saladin expected no resistance. His army advanced in a relaxed march, stretched across many kilometers. The Crusader forces seemed scattered, which meant they could be destroyed piece by piece. The enemy soldiers marched toward Ascalon without haste, setting up camps, stretching out their supply trains, and not bothering to form a proper battle line. The vanguard made no effort to organize for a serious clash. The Sultan was sure there would be no major battle, but Baldwin knew that if he struck now, at the very moment when the enemy was unformed and unprepared, he might have a chance. He led his troops toward the hills, from where they could look down on the Muslim army. At that moment, he ordered the reliquary of the true cross to be brought forward, the holy relic believed to be the symbol of divine protection over Christian lands. The warriors fell to their knees, asking God for help, fully aware that most of them would likely never leave that field alive. And after a short prayer, Baldwin gave the order to attack. The Templars went in first. They formed a wedge that was meant to pierce straight through the enemy ranks. They did not hesitate, and they did not lose formation. Their line resembled the tip of a spear aimed at the very heart of the foe. They crashed into the front lines of the Muslims, breaking their ranks, tearing apart their battle order, and spreading panic. The king's cavalry followed, smashing what was left of the forward detachments. Saladin tried to contain the onslaught, but his army simply did not have time to form up. The vanguard had already been destroyed. The troops in the center began to waver, while the baggage train and camp followers abandoned their wagons and horses, desperately trying to flee the crushing advance of the knights. The Mamluks, used to flexible maneuvers and flanking tactics, could not reorganize in time. In this situation, the Crusaders, fighting in tight formation and advancing in a coordinated front, gained a tremendous advantage. The battle lasted all day. The Crusaders attacked in waves, exploiting both surprise and the complete chaos in the enemy ranks. Their primary goal was not to allow the Muslims to regroup and form a unified striking force. They achieved this through relentless charges, leaving no pause for breath. They gave no rest to themselves and gave none to their enemy. By evening, the battle was won. The remnants of Saladin's army fled. The Sultan himself narrowly escaped capture, leaving the battlefield with only a small group of bodyguards. The Crusaders took enormous spoils: weapons, provisions, and siege engines. But their greatest prize was the victory itself. Montgisard became a triumph for Baldwin and his army. It was not just another battle. It was a blow that, for a time, halted the Muslim advance into the Holy Land. It was proof that discipline and tactics could defeat even a much larger army. If that army had overestimated its own strength, it was also a victory for the Templars, who showed that their endurance, cold calculation in battle, and iron will could change the course of a war. But the joy did not last long. Baldwin knew he had won a battle, not the war. Saladin learned from his defeat. He would never again allow such a mistake. He would return with a new army, stronger and better prepared. And next time, even the bravery of the Templars would not be enough to save Jerusalem. King Baldwin IV died without leaving an heir. After several years of turmoil, the throne passed to Guy de Lusignan, a weak, hot-tempered man with little understanding of military strategy. Tensions within the kingdom grew. Some barons did not trust the new king. And although the Templars remained the main military force of the Crusaders, they could no longer hold the Holy Land on their own. Saladin took advantage of this. Over the course of several years, he gradually weakened his enemies, raiding their lands, cutting off their fortresses from supply lines, and disrupting trade routes. The Crusaders could only watch as their kingdom slowly shrank, yet they still hoped they could withstand him if they brought him to a decisive battle. That was exactly what Saladin wanted. He waited for the Crusaders to march out to meet him, leaving the safety of their walls and walking right into a trap. In early July 1187, his army invaded Galilee and laid siege to the city of Tiberias. It was a deliberate provocation. The king could not simply abandon the city and its people, but marching to their aid was essentially a death sentence. The Templars and the more experienced knights understood this. They knew that in the July heat, under the blazing sun, marching without reliable access to water meant dooming the army to destruction. At first, the Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedefort, opposed the idea, but later he changed his mind. He believed that the army could not sit idle in Jerusalem while the enemy ravaged their lands. Other barons also demanded battle. In the end, a fateful decision was made: march to meet Saladin and fight him in open field. The Crusader army numbered around 20,000 men, including all able-bodied knights, infantry, and warriors of the military orders. They set out from Sephoria, a small town with a water source, and moved toward Tiberias. Saladin had already calculated their route and positioned his forces to cut the Crusaders off from water. He knew that in this climate, thirst would destroy an army faster than steel. The Crusaders advanced slowly. Their troops stretched across the scorched plain under a merciless sun. Their water supplies were running out, and the nearest source was still hours away. That was when Saladin ordered his cavalry to attack. They did not close in for hand-to-hand combat, but instead harassed the Crusaders from a distance, showering them with arrows and preventing them from moving forward. By nightfall, the Crusaders were trapped. They had almost no water left. Men were exhausted. Horses collapsed from dehydration. Their only hope was to break through to the Sea of Galilee, but the route to it was blocked. The next morning, the Crusader army found itself completely encircled. They took up defensive positions on 2 hills near the village of Hattin. But that could not save them. They had no water. The morning of July 4th, 1187, dawned. Saladin ordered his men to set fire to the dry grass. Hot smoke rolled over the Crusader lines, choking the already weakened soldiers. Dehydrated, exhausted, and half blind from heat and smoke, they could barely resist. When the Muslim army finally launched its assault, the balance of forces was hopelessly lopsided. By midday, the battle was decided. King Guy was taken prisoner. Along with him, nearly all the major barons were captured. The Grand Master of the Templars, Gerard de Riedefort, also fell into enemy hands. But the greatest tragedy was still to come. When the prisoners were brought into Saladin's tent, the Sultan ordered all Templars and Hospitallers to be executed. They were deemed too dangerous to be left alive. They were beheaded in front of the king's eyes. Gerard de Riedefort, however, escaped this fate. He did not go to his death as his brothers did. He waited humbly for his sentence and was soon released in exchange for the surrender of several Crusader fortresses. This became a stain on his name. The Templar Order had always prided itself on the fact that its warriors preferred death to captivity, that no Templar surrendered without a fight. But their Grand Master not only surrendered, he used his position to save his own life at the price of losing key castles. Hattin was not just a defeat. It was a catastrophe. Almost the entire Crusader army was destroyed. 3 months later, the Muslims entered Jerusalem. the Templars lost their chief stronghold, and their role in the Holy Land began to fade. Everything they had built over nearly a century collapsed in a single day. From that moment on, the Order, once terrifying and powerful, turned into a community of survivors trying to regain their lost influence. By the late 13th century, the Christian states in the East were living out their last days. After the disaster at Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem, the Crusaders never managed to restore what they had lost. Their once mighty kingdom shrank to a narrow coastal strip. Fortresses and cities fell one after another. The monarchs of Europe were no longer eager to send armies to the Holy Land. The crusading ideal had lost its former appeal, and papal calls to new expeditions increasingly met only indifference. In the East, meanwhile, Muslim rulers grew ever stronger. The last hope of the Christians was Acre, the capital of a weakened but still existing kingdom of Jerusalem. This city, on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea, was the key port and main citadel of the Crusaders. It remained a vital trading hub through which Eastern goods were shipped to Europe, and in return came knights, pilgrims, and supplies for the remaining garrisons. Acre housed embassies of European states, merchant quarters, the residences of the military orders, and the final battle, ready contingents of the Crusaders. If Acre fell, Christian power in the Holy Land would disappear forever. By 1290, it was clear that this moment was near. In the east, the Egyptian Sultan Al-Ashraf Khalil rose to power, determined to complete what his predecessors had begun. He gathered a massive army with the goal of wiping out the remaining Christian strongholds once and for all. In the spring of 1291, Muslim forces laid siege to Acre, beginning the last great battle of the Crusaders for the Holy Land. The Templars were among the city's main defenders. Although their order had been weakened by years of defeat, they still retained discipline and military skill. In Acre stood their powerful citadel, an imposing, heavily fortified stronghold. Alongside them in the city were the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, Genoese and Venetian mercenaries, and the remnants of the royal army. In total, the garrison numbered about 10,000 soldiers. The Muslims reached Acre's walls in early April. Their army was vastly larger, around 200,000 men, including cavalry, infantry, and sapper units specialized in undermining fortifications. They brought siege towers, trebuchets, battering rams, and tunneling teams who spent weeks digging under the walls. The Crusaders fought desperately, but the attackers methodically tore down the city's defenses. There was no respite. Assaults followed one after another. The defenders' archers fired day and night from the towers, and the knights launched sorties, trying to burn the siege engines. But the Muslim army was simply too numerous. One by one, Acre's towers collapsed, and by mid-May, it became clear the city was doomed. On May 19th, the Muslim troops broke into Acre. The slaughter began. The streets filled with fleeing townspeople, burning houses, and endless skirmishes. The Templars and Hospitallers held the line to the last, but their strength was fading fast. When it became clear that Acre could no longer be saved, the defenders withdrew into the last fortified quarters. The Templars locked themselves inside their citadel, a massive fortress on the seashore. It was the final Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. The Sultan offered them terms of surrender, but the Grand Master refused. The Muslims then launched a direct assault. Fighting raged for days, but the citadel's walls held firm. On May 28th, the Egyptians proposed a truce. According to the agreement, the surviving Templars would be allowed to leave the city by ship. However, when the knights came out of the citadel to negotiate the details, Muslim soldiers attacked them. Those who failed to retreat in time were cut down. The next day, the remaining Templars barricaded themselves inside their fortress and continued to resist. But it was over. They had no strength, no food, and no hope of relief. On May 25th, by some accounts at the end of May, the last defenders were killed, and the citadel itself was blown up. Thus ended the Christian story of the Holy Land. With the fall of Acre, the Crusaders finally lost their possessions in the east. The surviving Templars fled to Cyprus. The order still existed, but the loss of the Holy Land meant its original mission no longer had meaning. Acre became the last great battle of the Crusaders in the East. It marked the end of 2 centuries of Christian rule in the Holy Land and the end of an era. Their fortresses in the Holy Land had fallen, but in Europe, they remained a powerful force, possessing vast lands, wealth, and political influence. Yet, as their military mission faded, a growing aura of mystery began to form around the order. One of the most enigmatic symbols later associated with the Templars is the Holy Grail. Its legend is among the most mysterious and controversial stories of the Middle Ages. But what is the Grail? Was it truly connected to the Templars? Or is that only a myth woven over centuries? The origins of the Grail legend reach far beyond the Templars. The first mentions appear not in the Order's documents, but in Arthurian legends written down in the 12th century. One of the earliest authors to write about the Grail was the French poet Chrétien de Troyes. In his romance Percival, or The Story of the Grail, he describes a mysterious vessel endowed with sacred power. But in this early version, the Grail was not yet the chalice of the Last Supper. It was imagined more as a magical vessel that carried grace. Later, in the works of Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Eschenbach, the legend changed. The Grail became the holy cup from which Christ drank at the Last Supper. And then it was the same cup that caught his blood during the crucifixion. A connection appeared with early Christianity and with secret brotherhoods that supposedly guarded sacred relics. But how did this story become tied to the Templars? Some researchers believe that the Templars themselves may have been the keepers of the Grail. Already in the later Middle Ages, rumors began to circulate that the order possessed special relics brought back from Jerusalem. The link was also symbolic. The Templars were not just warriors. They were seen as secret guardians of Christian knowledge. Another layer of the legend arose thanks to the Cathars, a Christian movement persecuted by the Catholic Church. The Cathars were wiped out during the Albigensian Crusade, but before that, they were known for their esoteric teachings and the idea of hidden, sacred knowledge. Some later theories claimed that the Cathars possessed the Grail or some other powerful relic, and that shortly before their destruction, they passed it on to the Templars. Thus, the Grail, once a literary symbol, turned into a mystical secret tied to the disappearance of the Order's treasures. To this day, there is no proof that the Templars ever possessed anything of the sort. But the legend itself, born from a mixture of Arthurian myths, Gnostic ideas, and rumors about the Order's hidden riches, continues to fascinate people. If the Grail remained mostly a myth woven into chivalric romances, the Templars' connection to the Temple of Solomon was quite real. When the Order first appeared, its knights settled in the old temple complex on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. And that name was not chosen by accident. For several years, while there were still very few of them, they did not take part in battles and did not build castles. Their main task, it was believed, was to study the ruins of the temple. Later, when the order suddenly rose to power, rumors appeared that the Templars had found something that changed their fate. One of the most popular theories says that deep beneath the Temple Mount, there could have been sacred relics of ancient Israel, lost after the destruction of Jerusalem. Some believed that the Templars found the Ark of the Covenant, the greatest relic of the Old Testament, which once held the stone tablets with the 10 Commandments. According to legend, the Ark had been hidden away before the destruction of the first temple, and its location had remained a mystery ever since. Another version connects the Templars with secret texts that might have contained knowledge different from official Christian doctrine. In the Middle Ages, there were rumors that the priests of the temple had once possessed occult wisdom, later passed on only to the chosen few. If the Templars indeed found ancient scrolls containing some hidden truth about the origins of Christianity, this could explain their later conflict with the papacy. Supporters of more radical theories claimed that the order discovered something so dangerous that the church decided to destroy them. Perhaps it was information that undermined the dogmas of faith, or technologies far beyond the scientific level of medieval Europe. But there is a simpler explanation. The Templars may have discovered gold, jewels, or relics that they later used to strengthen their power. Within a very short time, the order became incredibly rich, and its financial might grew with each passing decade. Perhaps the secret treasures people whispered about were not mystical artifacts at all, but very real reserves of gold found in the ruins of Jerusalem. In any case, there is no proof of such discoveries. We know that the Templars really did settle in the temple complex and carried out excavations there. We know that shortly afterward they became powerful. Everything else is speculation and legend that has surrounded the order for centuries. Already in the Middle Ages, some believed that their power came not from money, but from ancient knowledge they supposedly gained in the Holy Land. Their connection with the Temple of Solomon led many to suspect that in Jerusalem, the order had found something more valuable than gold and relics. These ideas were reinforced by rumors that the Templars had contacts with Muslim and Jewish scholars, that they could access ancient manuscripts, and perhaps were even familiar with traditions reaching back to ancient Egypt and Babylon. Several centuries later, all these assumptions merged with another idea. The Templars might have been one of the first esoteric orders in Europe. By the 17th century, when Masonic lodges were spreading across Europe, a belief appeared that it was through them that the lost knowledge of the Templars had been passed down. Masons revered the Temple of Solomon as a sacred symbol. Their rituals were tied to ancient building traditions, and the process of initiation into a lodge resembled in some ways the strict discipline of the knightly orders. Some Masonic bodies directly claimed that their tradition descended from the Templars, and in later lodge statutes, special Templar degrees appeared, which supposedly went back to the time of the Crusades. But the legends did not end with the link to Masonry. In later centuries, a notion spread that the Templars had been connected to alchemy. In the Middle Ages, alchemy was seen not just as a science of metals, but as a secret system of knowledge that embraced the transformation of matter, the quest for immortality, and the search for the philosopher's stone. Rumors said that the Templars might have possessed knowledge that allowed them to create gold, use unknown technologies, or even alter human consciousness. Some sources claimed that they had received these secrets from Arab scholars, who at that time were far ahead of Europe in the natural sciences. Later on, these theories were expanded with claims that the order might have preserved lost texts containing ideas that did not match official Christian doctrine. In the Romantic era, many books appeared portraying the Templars as secret magicians, initiated into the hidden laws of the universe. From a scholarly point of view, none of this is proven. There is not a single reliable document linking the Templars directly to alchemy or to the Freemasons, nor is there any archaeological evidence that any special manuscripts were ever discovered in the Temple of Solomon. The Templars were indeed wealthy and powerful, but their secret lay not in occult knowledge. It lay in their ability to manage resources, wage campaigns, and build structures that resembled a state. All later theories arose, centuries after their destruction, and became part of a mythology that transformed the order from a military brotherhood into a symbol of a world-spanning mystery. By the early 14th century, the Templar Order was still one of the most influential organizations in Europe. They had lost the Holy Land, but not their wealth or power. Their commanderies were spread across Western Europe. They owned lands, castles, ports, and even trade routes. They controlled banking operations and granted loans to kings. The Templars did not answer to any monarch. Their only protector was the Pope, which made them independent even of the most powerful rulers. But such independence stirred resentment. In France, where the order wielded particularly strong influence, the Templars gained an enemy who would eventually destroy them. King Philip IV, known as Philip the Fair. Philip ascended the throne in 1285 and almost immediately ran into serious problems. His reign was marked by constant wars that demanded enormous spending. He fought with England, tried to seize Flanders, struggled for control over Navarre, and clashed with the papacy. All this required huge financial resources, and the royal treasury was running dry. The usual ways of raising money stopped working. New taxes provoked unrest among nobles and merchants. Philip even resorted to expelling the Jews and confiscating their property. But even that was not enough. Loans, Templars, became his only lifeline. For many years, the order had conducted financial operations, lending money to monarchs, nobles, and major merchants. They stored the funds of European rulers in their fortresses, handled transfers between kingdoms, and ensured the security of large transactions. Philip IV borrowed vast sums from them, but over time, it became obvious that he would never be able to pay them back. Then a dangerous idea came to him. If he could not repay the debt, it might be easier to destroy the creditor. Money, however, was not the only reason for his hostility toward the Templars. In Europe, Philip sought to establish absolute royal authority, and the Templars stood in his way. The order was too powerful and too independent. Their fortresses across France were effectively a state within a state, outside the king's control. Their financial dealings bypassed the monarchy, and above all, they answered only to the Pope. For Philip, this was unacceptable. He was already fighting for control over the church and had effectively brought the papacy under his influence. In 1305, he secured the election of a new pope, Clement V, who owed his position to the French king. Philip hoped that he could now also subdue the Templars, but the order refused to become a tool of the French crown. By 1307, Philip had reached a single conclusion: the order must cease to exist. This decision solved two problems at once. He rid himself of his debts and eliminated a dangerous political rival. But destroying such a powerful organization was not easy. If the king had openly declared war on the Templars, they could have retreated into their castles and organized resistance He needed a pretext that would make their elimination appear lawful. Soon, he found that pretext. And the day would come, October 13th, 1307, when the order would begin to vanish. By the autumn of 1307, the Templar Order still had no idea that its days of power were numbered. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was in Paris at the king's invitation, confident that the order remained secure. The Templars still possessed lands, castles, and enormous financial resources. And Pope Clement V, despite pressure from the French court, was in no hurry to condemn them. But Philip IV had already made up his mind. He knew it was impossible simply to strip the order of its power. If he openly moved against them, they could barricade themselves in their strongholds and rebel. So the king chose another tactic, a lightning blow that would catch the Templars completely off guard. Philip prepared the operation in advance. Secret orders were sent to royal officials weeks before the attack, but they were forbidden to open them until the appointed date. On the night of Friday, October 13th, 1307, thousands of royal soldiers moved out across France with one command: arrest all members of the order at the same time. The Templars were not expecting an attack. They were sure they were still under papal protection and did not even think of fortifying their positions. In a single night, the order lost its leaders, its treasuries, its administrative apparatus, and all coordination between its garrisons. In Paris, Jacques de Molay himself was seized, along with other high-ranking officials of the order. They were arrested without a fight, under the pretext that this was a direct order from the Pope. Royal forces captured the main treasury of the Templars, but the greatest treasures of the order had disappeared. By the morning of October 14th, all of France knew that the once invincible Templars had fallen in a single night. But the arrests were only the beginning. Now the king had to prove that the order truly deserved destruction. Philip could not simply say that he had destroyed the Templars for their money. To justify mass arrests, he needed accusations that would make the order enemies of the entire Christian world. In those days, the most terrible crimes were heresy, sorcery, and betrayal of the Christian faith. And these were exactly the charges brought against the Templars. First, royal investigators declared that the order practiced secret rites that contradicted the teachings of the Catholic Church. Under torture, the arrested Templars began to confess that at secret gatherings they spat on the craw renounced Christ and worshipped a demonic idol known as Baphomet. One of the most mysterious accusations against the Templars was this supposed worship of Baphomet. Investigators claimed that the order kept a strange head to which they offered secret devotions. Some testimonies said it was a skull, others that it was a statue with a bearded face, still others that it was an image of a demon with a goat's head. But what did this name even mean? Before the trial of the Templars, it never appeared in Christian documents. Some historians think the word Baphomet might be a distorted pronunciation of the name Muhammad, hinting at alleged contact between the Templars and Muslims. Others believe it was an occult symbol invented much later. In any case, there is no real evidence that the Templars ever worshipped Baphomet. Another key accusation was the claim that during initiation, new brothers spat on the cross and renounced Christ. According to the inquisitors, this was a ritual meant to prove their loyalty to the order, even if they had to turn away from the faith. In reality, there is no mention of any such practice before 1307. Most likely, this charge appeared because the investigators needed to prove that the order had secretly betrayed the church. Finally, another shocking accusation concerned sinful rituals involving homosexual acts between knights. During interrogations, Templars were forced to admit that during initiation, they had to kiss one another on the lips, the navel, and the buttocks, supposedly as a sign of complete submission to the order. Historians are confident this accusation was entirely fabricated. In the Middle Ages, homosexual relations were considered a mortal sin, and such claims were a convenient way to stain the order's reputation in the eyes of ordinary people. But the order did not surrender without a fight. Many knights refused to confess to heresy, insisting that all the charges were false. This did not suit the king. He could not allow the Templars to stand before the people and the church and refute the accusations. That is why a wave of torture began, designed to break the knights' will and force them to say the necessary words. The French Inquisition already had extensive experience with brutal interrogations. The Templars became victims of the harshest medieval tortures, torments that only a few could endure. In the dungeons, they were hung by their arms, their joints were broken, their skin was burned, their bodies stretched on the rack. Some spent weeks without water and food, in total darkness. The punishments were not designed to kill quickly, but to crush the victim's spirit. Under such cruelty, confessions began to appear. Knights driven to the brink of death agreed to confirm any accusation just to make the torment stop. They signed documents in which they admitted to renouncing Christ, worshiping Baphomet, and participating in secret rites. But as soon as some of the Templars were temporarily released from prison, they immediately recanted, declaring that their confessions had been forced out of them under torture. This put the Inquisition in a difficult position. Now those men had to be tortured again, or simply condemned to execution. For Philip IV, it was not enough just to obtain confessions. He wanted to erase the order from memory. So in 1312, Pope Clement V, who had previously tried to remain neutral, was forced to bow to the king's pressure and officially dissolve the order. This meant the end of the Templars as an institution. But the king could not allow the former leaders of the order to simply vanish. They still had one last trial to face. When the Templars were rising in power, they were led by great commanders. When the order lived through its age of glory, its grand masters were diplomats and politicians. But the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, entered history for another reason. He became a victim, a symbol, and a curse for his enemies. Jacques de Molay, who took command of the order at the end of the 13th century, was neither an adventurer nor a reformer. He believed in the Templars as a brotherhood of warriors loyal to the church. When the arrests began, he could not accept that popes and bishops would turn away from the order. Even when he was thrown into a dungeon, he hoped the church would intervene and save him. But the church kept silent. For 7 years, he was held in captivity, interrogated, and forced to sign confessions. And finally, in 1314, he was brought out to the square in front of Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris to hear the verdict. According to the king's plan, de Molay was supposed to acknowledge his guilt and publicly repent. But instead, he renounced all his previous confessions and loudly declared that the Templars were innocent and had been destroyed unjustly. It was a direct challenge the king could not ignore. The very next day, on March 18th, 1314, Jacques de Molay and his companions were burned at the stake on the Ile de la Cité. According to legend, when the flames engulfed Jacques de Molay's body, he pronounced a curse on his main enemies, the Pope and the King. Pope Clement, King Philip, before a year has passed, you will stand before God's judgment. These words may have been invented later, but a striking fact remains. Both his enemies did indeed die within a year of his execution. Pope Clement V died on April 20th, 1314, barely a month after de Molay's death. Contemporaries said he suffered from a painful illness and that he spent his last days in terror. Philip IV died in November of the same year, after a mysterious illness that struck him suddenly. Some claimed he slowly wasted away in agony. These coincidences gave birth to the legend of the Templars' curse. In the years that followed, Philip's dynasty quickly died out, and France was drawn into the 100 Years' War, plunging the kingdom into chaos. From a scholarly standpoint, there is no proof that Jacques de Molay really spoke this curse. The first mentions of it appear decades after his execution. Yet the fact remains, his enemies really did die soon after his death. Thus, the Order of the Templars came to an end. Its organization was destroyed, its legacy seemingly erased. But their story did not vanish. On the contrary, with each passing century, it became more mysterious, turning the fallen order into a symbol of hidden knowledge, conspiracies, and mystical forces. After the destruction of the order, it seemed that its influence would disappear forever. The Templars were branded heretics. Their lands were handed over to other organizations. Their commanders were executed, and their symbols and traditions consigned to oblivion. But history decided otherwise. The more time passed after their downfall, the deeper the mark they left on the world became. They did not simply remain in the past. They became part of the most enduring and captivating legends of the Middle Ages. The main question that still troubles historians and enthusiasts today is this: did the Templars truly disappear without a trace? Some researchers believe the order was not entirely destroyed, and that its legacy continued in the most unexpected forms. One of the most persistent theories claims that some knights escaped arrest and fled to the regions that would later become Switzerland. Within only a few decades of the order's fall, there appeared in this area military communities distinguished by harsh discipline and an unusual structure. These groups, known as Swiss mercenaries, became famous for not serving kings, but acting as independent brotherhoods, where each warrior received a share of the profits rather than serving a monarch or noble lord. Around the same time, the first banking structures appeared in Switzerland, famous for their secrecy, protection of deposits, and independence from royal power. This gave rise to the hypothesis that it was the Templars who laid the foundations of the future financial system, using their experience in handling money. There is, however, no direct proof that knights truly found refuge in Switzerland. Most likely, this is just a beautiful theory. But the idea that the Templars survived in a new guise continues to attract attention. More than 7 centuries have passed since the destruction of the order, yet their name has not faded from history. On the contrary, the further the Templars receded into the past, the more people turned them into something greater than mere warriors. In the 18th century, Romantic writers described them as victims of a conspiracy. And in the 19th century, they finally became a symbol of secret knowledge, hidden from ordinary people. They began to be associated with the search for the Holy Grail, with ancient mystical traditions, with Freemasonry, with secret societies supposedly ruling the world. Their image seeped into literature, cinema, and video games, becoming one of the great enigmas of world history. In popular culture, the Templars appear sometimes as guardians of sacred knowledge, sometimes as conspirators striving for world domination. Films like Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, or books like The Da Vinci Code, made them part of modern mythology. And games such as Assassin's Creed gave new life to the legend of the Order and its hidden enemies. But why they became the object of so many myths? Perhaps because their end was too abrupt and too mysterious. They were arrested in a single night. Their treasures were never found. Their trace in history seemed to break off suddenly. All this created the sense that behind the official story, there must be something more. If we set the myths aside, their true legacy lies not in conspiracies or mystical knowledge, but in the principles they developed and passed on to the world. Their experience with financial operations, the development of systems of money transfers and credit, their principles of military discipline and their knightly code, all this became part of the evolution of European civilization. Though they no longer exist as an order, their name lives on in symbols, traditions, and cultural phenomena they left behind. They began their path as warrior monks, but their influence went far beyond the battlefield. They became a symbol of secret knowledge, power, and authority. And their story remains one of the most enigmatic chapters of the Middle Ages. Our story for tonight has come to an end. Thank you for being with us on this journey through the centuries, through the marches of knights, the silence of stone temples, and the whisper of forgotten faith. Each time you listen, each comment you leave, Each kind word you share is like a small light that warms us in the night. Thank you for your trust, your attention, and the quiet in which these stories come to life. And now, let peace descend. May your sleep be deep, like the dungeons of the old temples, and bright, like a candle in a monk's cell. Close your eyes. Good night, my dear friends. Until the next lecture.